On November 22nd, 1963, two catastrophes struck America at almost exactly the same moment. One of them you know. The other one? Almost nobody does. While the world was watching Dallas, while news anchors were breaking down on live television, while America was trying to process the unthinkable, a completely separate disaster was unfolding, 60 miles north, in the back offices of Wall Street. Two brokerage firms had already collapsed. A third was hours away. 51 banks were holding hundreds of millions of dollars in collateral that, it turned out, didn't exist. And one of the most trusted financial brands in America, a company whose name was synonymous with reliability, with safety, with the promise that your money was always protected, was fighting for its life. The Kennedy assassination buried this story before it ever had a chance to breathe. And that's a shame, because what one man from the Bronx pulled off, with nothing more than a warehouse, a garden hose, and a devastatingly accurate read on human nature, is one of the most jaw-dropping financial crimes in American history. The whole thing came down to one insight. Simple, almost stupid. Oil floats on water. To understand how a fraud this large stays hidden this long, you have to understand the man at the center of it. Because Anthony Angelis, everybody called him Tino, is not the character you'd expect. He wasn't a Wall Street insider. No Harvard degree, no tailored suits, no silver tongue polished in boardrooms. Tino Angelis was a heavy-set kid from the Bronx, son of Italian immigrants, who dropped out of high school to support his family. His first job was in a meat and fish market. He swept floors and hauled crates. But here's the thing about Tino. He was genuinely, frighteningly talented. Within 3 years, still a teenager, he was managing 200 employees. He had a mind for logistics, for scale, for understanding how complicated systems worked, and critically, how they could be pushed in directions their designers never intended. In his early 20s, he borrowed $10,000, added $2,000 of his own, and opened a hog processing firm. He claimed he made $100,000 in his first year. He probably wasn't lying. But Tino had a flaw that ran deeper than his ambition. He had an ego that couldn't absorb failure. Every setback in his life, every collapse, every legal problem was somebody else's fault. Jealous competitors, a corrupt government, powerful forces working against him. And he told this story with such wounded conviction that intelligent, experienced, skeptical people believed him. That gift for making his own narrative feel more real than reality was what made him so dangerous. His first real scam came in the late 1940s. Tino had won a contract to supply meat to the government's newly launched National School Lunch Program. Guaranteed volume, guaranteed payment, the federal government as your customer. He supplied millions of pounds of uninspected product, overcharged on a scale that attracted investigators. And when they caught up with him, his company collapsed. Tino shrugged and started over. Most people don't get a second act after something like that. The government blacklists you. Your name becomes a warning. Tino got 5 acts. By 1955, he had reinvented himself completely. He founded Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Corporation in Bayonne, New Jersey, right on the waterfront, surrounded by enormous industrial storage tanks. He positioned himself as a major player in the U.S. government's Food for Peace program, the Cold War initiative to ship American agricultural surplus to recovering nations in Europe. And for a while, this is the part that always gets lost, it was all real. Legitimate government contracts, real trade relationships spanning multiple continents. At his peak, he was handling 68% of all U.S. vegetable oil exports. 68%. He called himself the Salad Oil King. He meant it as a title of pride. It turned out to be a confession. Then came the idea that changed everything. In the early 1960s, Tino discovered that American Express,
The company behind the traveler's checks in every tourist's wallet had quietly expanded into a business called field warehousing. The concept was straightforward. American Express would send inspectors to a company's physical inventory, certify how much product existed, and issue official warehouse receipts. Banks would use those receipts as collateral to issue loans. American Express earned fees. Banks got what they believed was independently guaranteed security. The genius of the system was its simplicity. No one had to take the borrower's word for it. A trusted third party had physically checked the inventory. The paper was as good as the product. Everybody trusted everybody. Tino saw the flaw immediately. If you control the warehouse and the inspector only ever checks the top of the tank, you can put anything underneath. He didn't ease into it. He went all the way.
Allied's storage facility had massive industrial tanks, 40, 50 feet tall, capable of holding millions of gallons. Tino's men began filling those tanks mostly with seawater. Then, through pipes running beneath the surface, they'd pump a thin layer of real soybean oil across the top, just enough to coat any measuring instrument that came down through the hatch. When American Express inspectors arrived, they'd follow standard procedure. Open the hatch, lower the rod, pull it back up. If the rod came back coated in oil, the tank was full of oil. Sign the receipt. That was the entire check. That was the whole system. Allied crude vegetable oil was supposed to be holding $150 million worth of vegetable oil as collateral. The actual inventory was worth around $6 million. The rest was seawater. And for years, nobody noticed. Not the inspectors, not the banks, not American Express. Because nobody ever pumped the tanks. They trusted the rod. They trusted the receipt. They trusted the system.
But Tino wasn't just stealing money. That's the part that makes this story genuinely extraordinary. He had a plan. A plan so reckless, it almost defies comprehension. He was trying to corner the global soybean oil market. Corner it, meaning buy enough futures contracts to control the price of the entire commodity. Drive the price up, cash out at the peak, repay the loans, walk away clean. This was Tino's vision of himself, not as a thief, but as a market genius. The fraud wasn't the end game. The fraud was the funding mechanism for what he believed would be his vindication. By 1962, he was leveraging fraudulent receipts to hold positions so enormous they were visibly distorting commodity markets. He was, in the truest sense, all in. And then, the math stopped working. The commodity exchanges grew uncomfortable with the scale of Tino's positions and pressured his primary broker, the respected Wall Street firm Ira Houpt & Company, to put up $14 million more in margin. Ira Houpt called Tino. Tino couldn't deliver. In a matter of days, a firm with 20,000 clients and decades of history discovered it was on the hook for losses it could never cover. And then, someone sent an anonymous tip to American Express. Over the weekend of November 15th, investigators went back to Bayonne. This time, they didn't just measure from the top. They cross-referenced. They ran the calculations. The tanks that were supposed to hold $150 million in oil held $6 million. They were looking at $144 million of seawater.
On November 19th, 1963, Allied Crude Vegetable Oil filed for bankruptcy. Tino filed personally the same day. Ira Houpt & Company collapsed entirely. 20,000 clients suddenly wondering what had happened to their accounts. A second firm, J.R. Williston and Bean, went down with it. American Express shares fell from $60 to $35, more than 40% in a matter of weeks. And then, 3 days later, on November 22nd, Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots in Dallas. The financial story that should have consumed headlines for months was swallowed whole by the greatest national tragedy of a generation. The New York Stock Exchange closed 83 minutes early that afternoon, partly because of the assassination and partly because the Ira Haupt collapse was already triggering a market panic. In the overwhelming grief of that Friday, the two disasters blurred together. The salad oil scandal, a fraud worth nearly $2 billion in today's money, slipped beneath the surface of history. Just like the oil in the tanks.
Tino Angelis served 7 years in federal prison. 7 years for $2 billion. He walked out and immediately tried to run a nearly identical scheme with livestock in the Midwest. He went back to prison. He died in 2009 at 93 years old in Eustis, Florida. In his final interviews, he spoke about his peak years without apology, without shame, with what can only be described as unsettling pride. From 1948 to 1963, he said, I was the largest exporter of vegetable oil and animal fats from the United States. I was the salad oil king. He was right. He just never mentioned what was in the tanks.
But here is where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. While American Express was bleeding, while executives were in emergency sessions, shareholders were dumping stock, and analysts were publicly questioning whether the company could survive, a 33-year-old investor from Omaha, Nebraska, was doing something that looked to everyone around him like pure madness. He was buying. Warren Buffett had always found American Express interesting, but he'd never pulled the trigger. The salad oil scandal gave him his moment. And Buffett didn't just read the balance sheet. He didn't call analysts. He worked the way only Buffett worked. He sent someone to talk to the people who actually used American Express every day. Bank tellers, hotel managers, travel agents, restaurant owners. He wanted to know one thing. Had a single one of these people changed how they felt about American Express because of the scandal? The answer, almost universally, was no. Nobody trusted the company less. If anything, the way American Express was stepping forward to accept liability, choosing to settle rather than fight, was making customers trust it more. Buffett understood something the panicking market had completely missed. The fraud hadn't touched the core of what made American Express valuable. Not a single traveler's check had bounced. Not a single card had been declined. The brand, the loyalty, the institutional trust that millions of ordinary people had built with that little blue card over decades, none of that was stored in the tanks in Bayonne. The scandal was a subsidiary problem. The company itself was sound. Between 1964 and 1966, Buffett deployed 40% of his entire investment partnership into American Express stock. 40%. $13 million, his largest single investment ever. This was not a hedge. This was a conviction bet, the kind that either defines a career or ends one. By 1967, American Express had settled all claims for $60 million. The stock that cratered at $35 began to recover. Then it climbed. Then it kept climbing. Over the following decade, it made a tenfold move. One of the greatest investments in the history of financial markets. A Bronx con man nearly destroyed American Express. A young investor from Omaha used the wreckage to build a fortune. There is one detail from this story that has never stopped haunting the people who study it. Those American Express inspectors visited Allied's tanks for years, month after month. Same procedure. Arrive, climb to the top, open the hatch, lower the rod, pull it back, check the coating, sign the receipt. And every single time, the rod came back up oily. Every time, the numbers matched. Every time, the paperwork was clean. Nobody ever pumped the tanks. The entire structure, the warehouse receipts, the bank loans, the American Express guarantee, 51 institutions holding hundreds of millions in collateral, rested on a single assumption, that what you could see from the top of a tank was representative of everything beneath it. Tino Angelis didn't beat the system through genius or complexity. He beat it through a gap. The gap between what the system was designed to verify and what it actually chose to look at.
The banks assumed American Express had checked. American Express assumed its inspectors had measured carefully. The inspectors assumed the paperwork matched reality. Every link in the chain trusted the one before it. Nobody looked all the way down.
That's the real lesson of the salad oil scandal. Not that Tino was a criminal mastermind. Not that the banks were uniquely foolish. The lesson is that every system of trust has a depth limit. A point where verification stops and assumption quietly takes over. Where habit and routine and the simple human desire not to do one more step of work fills in the gaps. Tino found that depth limit. He built his entire empire in the dark water below it. And for a few remarkable years, from his perch in Bayonne overlooking tanks full of seawater dressed up as gold, he was exactly what he claimed to be, the salad oil king.
If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more incredible true events, forgotten histories, and fascinating mysteries, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us create more videos like this and bring these amazing stories to life. And if you have any thoughts or theories about today's story, share them in the comments below. We read every one of them. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.